In the grand halls of Ravenwood Abbey, where duty reigned supreme and emotions were locked behind ancestral portraits, a duke made a promise he would soon regret. When his rebellious sister defied every governess sent to tame her, he hired the one woman whose intellect matched her spirit, never imagining that his vow of indifference would crumble the moment she challenged not just his sister, but his very soul. What began as a calculated arrangement would ignite a scandal that would shake the foundations of Regency society, but would pride destroy them both before love could prevail. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning frost clung to the windows of Ravenwood Abbey like crystallized disappointment, each pane reflecting the grey January sky that hung over Derbyshire's rolling hills. Inside the Duke's private study, Alexander Dashwood, the 5th Duke of Ravenwood, stood with his back to the enormous mahogany desk, staring at the letter that had arrived at dawn. The wax seal bore the crest of Miss Henderson's Academy for Young Ladies, the 7th institution to politely decline his sister's enrollment in as many months. "Your Grace," the letter began with practiced diplomacy, "while Lady Catherine possesses remarkable intellectual capacity, her temperament proves incompatible with our establishment's philosophy." Alexander crushed the letter in his fist. At 28, he had inherited not only one of England's most prestigious dukedoms, but also the guardianship of his 15-year-old sister, a responsibility that felt more burdensome with each passing day. Catherine was brilliant, passionate, and utterly ungovernable. Since their parents' tragic carriage accident 2 years prior, she had driven away 9 governesses, been expelled from 3 boarding schools, and turned their ancestral home into a battlefield of wills. The study door burst open without the courtesy of a knock. Lady Catherine Dashwood swept in, her dark curls escaping their pins, her morning dress already stained with ink and what appeared to be soil from the conservatory. Her grey eyes, so like their late mother's, blazed with defiance. "I heard the Morning Post arrived," she announced, chin lifted. "Another rejection, I presume." "Catherine." Alexander's voice carried the weight of aristocratic authority. "You will learn to knock before entering my private rooms. And you will learn that locking me away in some insipid academy will not make me the demure, embroidery-obsessed ornament society expects." She crossed her arms. "I want to study natural philosophy, mathematics, languages, not deportment and watercolors." "You want to study scandal and social ruin," Alexander countered, turning to face her fully. At 6 feet 2 inches, he cut an imposing figure. Dark hair swept back from a face that combined their father's strong jaw with their mother's refined features. His blue eyes, however, were entirely his own. Cold, calculating, and at this moment, exhausted. "Your behavior has made you notorious, Catherine. Do you understand what that means for your future, for this family's reputation? I understand that you care more about appearances than my happiness." Her voice cracked slightly, revealing the hurt beneath the bravado. Mother would have understood. The mention of their mother struck deep. Alexander turned back to the window, jaw tight. "Mother is gone. I am responsible for you now, and I will not watch you destroy your prospects because of your stubborn pride." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantel. Finally, Alexander spoke again, his tone resigned. "There is one option remaining. Mr. Pemberton has recommended a private tutor, a woman of exceptional learning, who has taught the daughters of several notable families." "Another governess?" Catherine's laugh was bitter. "How long before she flees in tears?" "This one is different." Alexander retrieved another letter from his desk. "Miss Eleanor Beaumont comes with the highest recommendations from Lord Ashford himself. She educated his 3 daughters, each of whom made excellent marriages despite being considered intellectually formidable." "Lord Ashford's daughters?" Catherine's interest flickered despite herself. "I've read Lady Margaret's treatise on botanical classification. It was brilliant." Miss Beaumont taught her. Alexander allowed himself a small smile of victory. She arrives tomorrow. You will give her a fair chance, Catherine, or I will exercise my authority as your guardian and make decisions you will find far less palatable. Catherine studied her brother's face, recognizing the steel beneath his words. Very well, she said finally, but if she tries to teach me needlepoint, I shall ensure her stay is remarkably brief. After his sister departed in a swirl of skirts and indignation, Alexander returned to his desk, where another letter lay waiting. This one from his betrothed, Lady Victoria Pemberton. Her delicate handwriting reminded him of their engagement ball scheduled for spring, a union that would merge two of England's greatest fortunes and solidify his position in society. Victoria was everything a duchess should be, beautiful, accomplished in all the appropriate arts, and from an impeccable family. She also possessed the emotional depth of a decorative pillow and the intellectual curiosity of a potted plant. But these were not qualities one required in a wife. Marriage was a duty, a strategic alliance. Love was for poets and fools. He had chosen well, he told himself. Victoria would never challenge him, never disrupt the careful order of his life, never ignite the kind of passion that had destroyed his parents' happiness in the end. His mother's fierce intelligence and his father's stubborn pride had made their later years a cold war of silences and separate wings. Alexander had vowed never to repeat their mistakes. The clock struck 10. Outside, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting sharp shadows across the manicured grounds. Somewhere in the distance, he heard his sister's voice raised in argument with the housekeeper about something involving the conservatory and experimental horticulture. Tomorrow, Miss Eleanor Beaumont would arrive. Alexander made a firm decision. He would remain completely indifferent to his sister's new tutor. She would be hired help, nothing more. He would barely acknowledge her presence, communicate only through Mrs. Ashworth, the housekeeper, and certainly never engage her in conversation beyond what civility absolutely demanded. This resolution made, he turned his attention to estate documents, determined to maintain the control that had served him so well since assuming his title. What he could not know, what his careful plans and aristocratic certainty could not anticipate, was that Eleanor Beaumont would prove to be the one variable he had never calculated, the one force that would shatter every wall he had built around his heart. As evening fell over Ravenwood Abbey, the household prepared for their new arrival with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Catherine retreated to her rooms to read, curiosity warring with suspicion. The servants whispered among themselves, taking bets on how long this governess would last, and Alexander sat alone in his study, staring at the flames in the fireplace, utterly confident in his ability to remain unmoved. He was, after all, the Duke of Ravenwood. Control was his birthright, indifference his armor. Nothing and no one could penetrate the careful distance he maintained from the world. Tomorrow would prove him devastatingly wrong. The carriage arrived at Ravenwood Abbey precisely at 11 o'clock, its wheels crunching on the frost-covered drive with a sound like breaking glass. From his study window, Alexander watched its approach with studied disinterest. Determined to honor his vow of indifference, he would not greet this new governess personally. That task belonged to Mrs. Ashworth. He would not observe her arrival like some lovesick boy. He was a duke, and he had correspondence to attend to. Yet he found himself unable to turn away as the carriage door opened. Eleanor Beaumont emerged into the winter sunlight like a figure from a Renaissance painting. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too strong, her bearing too confident. At 26, she possessed the kind of presence that made beauty seem a lesser currency. Tall for a woman, she moved with unhurried grace as she surveyed the Abbey's imposing facade, her intelligent grey-green eyes missing nothing. Her travelling dress was of excellent quality, but understated, speaking of taste rather than ostentation. Dark auburn hair was swept back in a simple but elegant style, revealing a face marked by character. High cheekbones, a determined chin, and a mouth that suggested both humor and strength. What struck Alexander most, and he told himself he was merely observing, not noticing, was her complete lack of intimidation. Most visitors approached Ravenwood Abbey with appropriate awe. Miss Beaumont regarded it as one might regard an interesting geological formation, with curiosity but without subservience. "Your Grace should see the new governess," Mrs. Ashworth announced, appearing at his study door. "She's quite different." "I am occupied," Alexander said crisply, finally turning from the window. "You will manage the introductions and show her to her quarters. Lady Catherine may meet her at tea." "Of course, Your Grace." The housekeeper's tone suggested she found his behavior curious, but she knew better than to comment. Alexander forced himself to remain at his desk for exactly 30 minutes, reviewing tenant reports with determined focus. Then, telling himself it was merely coincidence, he happened to walk past the library precisely when Catherine's first lesson was scheduled to begin. The library at Ravenwood Abbey was one of England's finest private collections. 3 stories of books, spiral staircases and reading alcoves beneath a painted ceiling depicting the Muses. Alexander had spent countless hours here as a boy, and it remained his favourite room in the vast estate. He paused outside the partially open door, hearing voices within. "Completely disagree with Linnaeus's classification system as inherently superior," Catherine was saying, her tone animated in a way Alexander rarely heard anymore. "His sexual system of botanical taxonomy is artificial and overlooks natural relationships between species." "An astute observation, Lady Catherine." Miss Beaumont's voice was rich and cultured, with a warmth that managed to convey respect without condescension. "You've clearly studied Jussier's natural system. What do you think of his approach?" "I think he's closer to truth, grouping plants by multiple characteristics rather than arbitrary reproductive structures. But even he has limitations." Alexander found himself stepping closer, drawn by his sister's enthusiasm. Through the gap in the door, he could see them seated at the library's main table, surrounded by botanical texts and sketches. Catherine's face was alight with intellectual passion, while Miss Beaumont listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that deepened rather than redirected the discussion. "Your brother believes I'm here to teach you needlepoint and deportment," Miss Beaumont said suddenly, a note of amusement in her voice. Catherine snorted inelegantly. "He believes all women should be decorative and silent." "Does he?" Miss Beaumont's tone grew thoughtful. "Or does he believe the world requires women to be decorative and silent, and he's trying to protect you from the consequences of defying those expectations?" The observation startled Alexander. It was uncomfortably perceptive. Catherine frowned. I hadn't considered that distinction." "Your brother carries considerable responsibility," Miss Beaumont continued. "His methods may be misguided, but perhaps his intentions merit examination. However, that doesn't mean we must accept his limitations." She smiled, and Alexander felt something shift in his chest. "We shall prove that a woman can be both intellectually formidable and socially successful. We'll master the expectations while transcending them." "How?" Catherine leaned forward eagerly. "Strategy, my dear. We'll study not just natural philosophy and mathematics, but also the natural philosophy of society itself. Human behavior, social dynamics, the unspoken rules that govern interaction. Once you understand the system, you can navigate it without surrendering your authentic self." Alexander felt himself inadvertently leaning closer. Captivated despite his intentions, this woman was not what he had expected. She was not intimidated by his sister, not desperate to impose conformity, not "Your Grace." Mrs. Ashworth's voice behind him made him start, like a guilty schoolboy. "Forgive me, but Lord Pemberton has arrived for your appointment." "Yes, thank you." Alexander straightened, pulling dignity around himself like armor. He cast one final glance toward the library, meeting, for just a moment, Miss Beaumont's eyes through the gap in the door. She had known he was there. Her slight smile confirmed it, and something in that smile suggested amusement at his expense. Heat rose to his face as he turned away sharply. This would not do. He would not be affected by his sister's governess, no matter how intelligent or perceptive she proved. He had Victoria, his duty, his carefully ordered life. That evening, the household gathered for dinner, a formal affair where Alexander typically presided in solitary magnificence, with Catherine eating in her rooms when she chose to eat at all. Tonight, however, Mrs. Ashworth had made an executive decision. "Miss Beaumont will take her meals with the family," the housekeeper announced, appearing in his study an hour before dinner. "Lady Catherine insists, and I believe it appropriate given Miss Beaumont's status and education." Alexander wanted to object. His vow of indifference would be difficult to maintain across the dinner table, yet to refuse would reveal that Eleanor Beaumont affected him, which was absurd. She did not affect him. He was merely cautious. "As you think appropriate," he said dismissively. Dinner became an exercise in exquisite torture. Catherine, transformed by intellectual engagement, dominated the conversation with questions about astronomy, politics, and natural history. Miss Beaumont answered with knowledge that rivaled Alexander's own extensive education, her mind moving with impressive agility across subjects. Alexander maintained silence, consuming his soup with concentrated attention. He would not engage. He would not be drawn into discussion. He would remain precisely as indifferent as he had determined. "Your Grace," Miss Beaumont addressed him directly, her tone respectfully neutral. "Lady Catherine mentioned your library contains a first edition of Newton's Principia. Would you permit me to examine it? I'm researching the evolution of mathematical notation for a monograph I'm writing." He looked up, meeting her eyes fully for the first time. They were extraordinary, grey-green flecked with gold and lit by fierce intelligence. In that moment, he understood why his carefully maintained indifference was already crumbling. "You're writing a monograph." The question emerged before he could stop it, surprise overriding his resolution. "On the intersection of mathematical notation and philosophical thought in the 17th century. Her smile was modest but held quiet pride. "I'm fortunate to have studied with several scholars who recognize that intellectual capacity is not limited by gender, merely opportunity." "Most unusual," Alexander said stiffly, trying to regain his emotional distance. "Most necessary," she countered gently. "Knowledge should not be hoarded by the privileged few, Your Grace. It should be shared, challenged, expanded. Surely you, with this magnificent library, understand the democratic nature of ideas." It was not an attack, yet it felt like one, or rather like a gauntlet thrown. She was challenging not just his assumptions, but his very understanding of the world. No one challenged the Duke of Ravenwood, certainly not a hired governess. "Books and ideas are indeed valuable," he replied coldly. "But the world operates on more than theoretical principles, Miss Beaumont. Society has structures for good reason. Order, hierarchy, tradition, these prevent chaos. They also prevent progress," she responded, her tone remaining respectful but firm. "And sometimes, Your Grace, what we call order is merely the comfortable arrangement that benefits those already in power." Silence fell over the table. Catherine watched with wide eyes, clearly thrilled by this unprecedented challenge to her brother's authority. Alexander felt his jaw tighten, anger and something else, something uncomfortably like admiration, warring within him. "You are bold, Miss Beaumont," he said finally, his voice carrying aristocratic ice. "I am honest, Your Grace," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I understood, when accepting this position, that honesty would be valued over flattery. Was I mistaken?" The question hung in the air between them, a test he hadn't anticipated. He could dismiss her now, reassert his authority, retreat behind the walls of his rank, or he could— "You were not mistaken," he heard himself say, surprising even himself, "though honesty carries risks." "All worthwhile things do," she replied softly, and her smile held something that made his heart beat unaccountably faster. Alexander returned to his meal, but the food had lost all taste. Beside him, Catherine was barely containing her glee at this exchange. Across the table, Eleanor Beaumont continued dining with perfect composure, as though she hadn't just upended his careful world. After dinner, Alexander retreated to his study and poured himself a generous brandy. Through the window, he could see lamplight in the library, where Miss Beaumont had presumably gone to examine the Newton volume. He found himself watching that distant glow, remembering the way candlelight had caught the auburn highlights in her hair, the way her eyes had challenged him without disrespect, the way her voice had carried both strength and warmth. This would not do. He was engaged to Victoria. He had responsibilities, a position to maintain, a carefully constructed life that left no room for passionate intellectual equals who looked at him as though seeing past every defense he'd built. Eleanor Beaumont was his employee, nothing more. He would resume his indifference immediately. The resolution felt hollow, even as he made it. Somewhere deep in the foundations of his certainty, a crack had formed. And through that crack, despite all his efforts to prevent it, something dangerous had begun to grow. The weeks that followed Eleanor Beaumont's arrival transformed Ravenwood Abbey in ways Alexander had not anticipated. Catherine flourished under her tutor's guidance, her rebellious energy channeled into intellectual pursuits that actually seemed to provide satisfaction. The household, initially skeptical, began to regard Miss Beaumont with something approaching reverence. Even Mrs. Ashworth, stern guardian of propriety, seemed charmed. Alexander maintained his distance, or tried to. Yet proximity in a shared household proved impossible to entirely avoid, and each accidental encounter chipped away at his defenses. He found her one morning in the conservatory at dawn, cataloguing rare orchids with Catherine. Both women were laughing at some private joke, their faces flushed from the humid warmth, and the sight struck him with unexpected force. Eleanor had removed her Spencer jacket. Her simple muslin dress revealed the elegant line of her shoulders and throat as she leaned over a particularly exotic bloom. When she noticed him at the doorway, her smile faded into polite acknowledgement. "Your Grace, we didn't expect anyone at this hour. I often walk the grounds at dawn," he replied stiffly. It was true, though he'd never before extended his walk to include the conservatory. "Alexander never comes in here," Catherine observed, with sisterly bluntness. "Says the humidity ruins his coats." "Lady Catherine, perhaps we should return to the house for breakfast," Eleanor suggested gently, though her eyes remained on Alexander's face. "We've catalogued sufficient specimens for today." As they passed him on their way out, Eleanor's sleeve brushed his arm, the merest contact, yet it sent heat through him like touching flame. Her scent reached him. Lavender and something else, perhaps the ink she used for her monograph, perhaps simply her own essence. He stood frozen as they departed, staring at the orchids without seeing them, his heart beating far too fast for so innocuous an encounter. The library became a particular source of torment. Alexander had always treated it as his private sanctuary, but Eleanor used it regularly for lessons. He would arrive to find her there with Catherine, or sometimes alone, working on her research. Professional courtesy demanded he acknowledge her presence, yet each acknowledgement led to conversation, and conversation revealed depths that fascinated him against his will. One afternoon, discovering her alone among the philosophy texts, he made the mistake of asking about her monograph's progress. "It advances slowly," she admitted, looking up from her notes. Rain drummed against the high windows, creating an intimate atmosphere despite the room's vastness. The intersection of mathematical symbolism and philosophical thought requires bridging two distinct scholarly traditions. Most mathematicians dismiss philosophy as impractical wool-gathering, while philosophers often lack the mathematical literacy to engage seriously with notation as language. "You bridge both traditions," Alexander observed, moving closer despite his intentions. "How did you acquire such education? Most women—" He stopped, realizing the condescension implicit in his words. Eleanor's smile held understanding rather than offense. "Most women are denied the opportunity, Your Grace. I was fortunate. My father was a clergyman with a magnificent library and no sons to educate. He taught me alongside hiring tutors, never considering my gender a limitation. When he died, his friend, a Cambridge professor, continued my education informally. I've served as a tutor for 20 years, since I was quite young, and used my earnings to purchase books and correspondence with scholars. 20 years, Alexander calculated quickly. You began tutoring at 6 years old? She laughed, the sound warm and genuine. I began learning at 6, tutoring at 16. I'm 26 now, Your Grace, though I appreciate the implied flattery. He felt heat rise to his face, a sensation he hadn't experienced since adolescence. I meant no, that is, I was merely surprised that hired governesses might have complex histories. Her tone held gentle teasing. We're not produced whole and anonymous from some factory of refined women, Your Grace. We have pasts, ambitions, intellectual lives beyond our current station. I never thought, but he had thought exactly that. Or rather, he'd never thought about governesses at all. They were part of the household machinery, like superior servants. The realization shamed him. Your Grace, Eleanor's voice softened, losing its teasing edge. You're not unique in that blindness. Society requires it. The moment we acknowledge the full humanity of those we employ, we must confront uncomfortable questions about justice and desert. You speak like a radical, Alexander said, but without heat. I speak like someone who has observed the world from a position society renders invisible, she replied. There's remarkable clarity in invisibility. One sees truths that the powerful miss because acknowledging them would threaten comfortable certainties. They stood perhaps 3 feet apart, close enough that Alexander could see the gold flecks in her eyes, close enough to observe the rapid pulse at her throat. The rain intensified, drumming louder against glass. Somewhere in the distance a door closed. They were alone in this vast room, surrounded by thousands of volumes that suddenly seemed irrelevant compared to the living text of Eleanor Beaumont's face. You threaten comfortable certainties, Alexander said quietly, surprising himself with the admission. Do I? Her voice had gone soft, and something in her expression suggested she felt the same dangerous pull he did. That's not my intention, Your Grace. Intentions matter little when consequences are inevitable. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them to less than propriety allowed. You are not what I expected, Miss Beaumont. What did you expect? She whispered. Someone ordinary, someone ignorable, someone who would not make me question. He stopped, appalled at what he had been about to confess. Question what? Eleanor's eyes searched his face. The door to the library opened with sudden violence. Catherine burst in, heedless of atmosphere or interruption. Eleanor, I've had the most brilliant idea about Lady Pemberton's musical evening next week. If you were to attend, you could meet some truly intelligent women who... She stopped, looking between them with sudden awareness. Oh, am I interrupting? Not at all, Eleanor said smoothly, stepping back and turning to Catherine with apparent calm. Only the heightened colour in her cheeks betrayed any discomposure. What is your idea, my dear? Alexander excused himself with cold formality, retreating to his study where he poured brandy with shaking hands. This had to stop. He was engaged to Victoria. His wedding was mere weeks away. Eleanor Beaumont was his employee, and beyond the impropriety, there was the simple fact that any attachment would destroy her reputation utterly. He would not be the kind of man who took advantage of a woman in his household's employ. Yet that evening at dinner, he found himself watching her across the table with an intensity he couldn't control. The way she listened to Catherine with complete attention. The way her mind moved through complex ideas with elegant precision. The way she laughed freely, joyfully at his sister's wit. Eleanor Beaumont was fully alive in a way Victoria had never been, could never be. Victoria. The thought of his betrothed should have brought guilt, but instead brought only a dull recognition of impending duty. Lady Victoria Pemberton was arriving in 3 days for an extended visit before their spring wedding. She would stay at Ravenwood Abbey with her mother, Lady Pemberton, who served as chaperone. It would be the final test of their compatibility, though nothing about their carefully negotiated engagement had ever involved genuine compatibility. After dinner, Alexander found himself drawn once more to the library, knowing he should avoid it, knowing Eleanor often worked there in the evenings. She was there as he'd known she would be, standing on the tall ladder that reached the upper shelves, retrieving a volume. "Miss Beaumont!" His voice came out rougher than intended. She startled, the book slipping from her hands. Alexander moved with instinct, catching both the falling volume and Eleanor herself as she lost balance. Suddenly she was in his arms, her weight warm and real against his chest, her face inches from his own. They froze, locked in the dangerous intimacy of the moment. "I have you," Alexander said unnecessarily, his voice low. "You shouldn't," Eleanor whispered, but she didn't pull away. Her hands had come to rest on his shoulders, and her eyes held the same conflict he felt. Attraction, warring with propriety, desire, fighting duty. "I know," he said, but still he didn't release her. "Eleanor," the use of her given name was crossing a line they both recognized. Her breath caught, her fingers tightening on his shoulders. "Don't," she said softly. "Please, Your Grace, you're engaged. I'm your employee. This cannot, must not." "I know," he repeated, but his arms remained around her, supporting her suspended weight. The position was impossible to maintain, yet neither moved to change it. "Alexander." His name on her lips struck him like physical blow. "Your betrothed arrives in 3 days. Whatever this, whatever you think you feel, it's proximity and novelty, nothing more. Lady Pemberton will be your duchess, the mother of your children, your partner in building the future of this estate. I'll be gone within the year, moving to another family, another position. This moment is fiction. Your life with her is reality." The words were brutal in their accuracy. They broke the spell. Alexander carefully lowered Eleanor to the floor, stepping back immediately. The space between them felt simultaneously too great and not nearly great enough. "You're right, of course," he said, his voice returning to aristocratic formality. "Forgive my impropriety, Miss Beaumont. It will not be repeated." "There's nothing to forgive, Your Grace." Her composure had returned, though her color remained high. "An accident, nothing more." They both knew it was a lie. But lies, Alexander reflected as he left the library with forced calm, were sometimes necessary to maintain the social order. He would marry Victoria. He would forget these dangerous moments. He would do his duty. In the library, Eleanor Beaumont stood motionless for long minutes, one hand pressed to her chest as if to quiet her thundering heart. She had come to Ravenwood Abbey to teach, to earn her living as she always had, to maintain her independence and intellectual life despite society's constraints. She had not come to fall in love with a duke who belonged to another woman. Yet as rain continued to drum against the windows and distant thunder rolled across the Derbyshire hills, she acknowledged a truth she had tried to deny. It was already too late for preventing the fall. The only question now was how to survive the inevitable landing. Lady Victoria Pemberton arrived at Ravenwood Abbey in a cavalcade of carriages bearing herself, her mother Lady Pemberton, 3 ladies' maids, a mountain of trunks, and an air of proprietary confidence. At 23, Victoria was acknowledged as one of the season's great beauties. Golden-haired, blue-eyed, with porcelain skin and features of classical perfection. She moved through life with the serene assurance of one who had never been denied anything she desired. Alexander greeted his betrothed with appropriate warmth, bowing over her hand, welcoming her to what would soon be her home. Victoria's answering smile was lovely and utterly empty of genuine feeling, a performance so practiced it had become indistinguishable from personality. "My dear Duke," she said in her melodious voice, "how wonderful to finally see Ravenwood Abbey. Mother and I have such plans for redecorating once we're married. The current style is rather antiquated." Alexander felt something cold settle in his chest, but maintained his pleasant expression. Ravenwood has remained largely unchanged for 3 generations. There's comfort in tradition. Comfort, perhaps, but hardly fashion. Victoria laughed, a sound like expensive wind chimes. But we needn't discuss such tedious matters now. I'm eager to meet your sister. I've heard she's quite spirited. The word spirited in Victoria's mouth sounded like a polite substitute for something far less flattering. They found Catherine in the library with Eleanor, both bent over a mathematics text, their heads close together as they worked through some complex proof. "Catherine," Alexander said from the doorway, "Lady Victoria has arrived." His sister looked up, and Alexander saw her face close, her earlier animation vanishing behind polite formality. She rose, curtsying with mechanical precision. "Lady Pemberton, welcome to Ravenwood Abbey." Victoria swept into the room, her elaborate morning dress making Eleanor's simple muslin look shabby by comparison, though to Alexander's eyes, Eleanor's understated elegance held far more genuine beauty. Victoria's gaze slid over Eleanor dismissively, categorizing her as a servant and therefore beneath notice. "How charming," Victoria said, though her tone suggested she found nothing charming at all. "You study mathematics? How very unusual." "Miss Beaumont is teaching me the calculus," Catherine said, her chin lifting slightly. "We're working through Newton's proofs of planetary motion." How exhausting that sounds. Victoria settled gracefully into a chair, arranging her skirts with practiced ease. "I've always believed excessive learning rather ruins a young woman's complexion. All that concentration causes frown lines." Eleanor's expression remained neutral, but Alexander saw the flash in her eyes, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. Catherine, less practiced at concealing her feelings, looked ready to deliver a scathing retort. Alexander intervened quickly. "Miss Beaumont, perhaps you could show Lady Catherine the conservatory. Lady Victoria, would you walk with me in the portrait gallery? There are paintings of the family you should see." It was a transparent separation, but necessary. As Catherine and Eleanor left through one door, Alexander led Victoria through another. Behind them, he heard his sister's voice raised in frustration, Eleanor's quieter tones soothing her. He felt a pang of something very like envy. Eleanor got to escape Victoria's company, while he was condemned to endure it. The following days fell into a torturous pattern. Mornings, Alexander managed estate business, while Victoria redecorated his home in planning, if not yet in fact, discussing fabric choices and furniture arrangements with her mother. Afternoons brought formal calls, where local gentry came to pay respects to the Duke's betrothed. Eleanor was always present at these gatherings, in her role as Catherine's governess, seated slightly apart from the main company, but close enough to observe. Alexander found himself watching Eleanor when he should have been attending to Victoria. He noticed how Eleanor listened to conversations with genuine interest, how her expression reflected intelligence and empathy, how she occasionally caught his eye with a look that suggested shared amusement at social absurdities. Meanwhile, Victoria spoke only of fashion, gossip, and herself, subjects that held decreasing interest with each repetition. The crisis came on the 4th evening of Victoria's visit, during a dinner party Alexander had arranged to introduce his betrothed to local society. 20 guests filled Ravenwood Abbey's formal dining room, the candlelight gleaming off silver and crystal, conversations flowing with wine and carefully observed protocol. Catherine had been permitted to attend, and Eleanor by extension, though she was seated near the table's foot, physically present, but socially invisible. The Earl of Worthington, an elderly scholar and family friend, recognized Eleanor immediately. "Miss Beaumont," he exclaimed with genuine delight. "I didn't realize you were at Ravenwood Abbey. I read your article in the Philosophical Transactions last year. Quite brilliant analysis of Leibniz's notation system." The table fell silent. All eyes turned to Eleanor, who had flushed at this unexpected attention. Victoria looked confused, then vaguely affronted that a governess had been published in a prestigious journal. "You're too kind, Lord Worthington," Eleanor said quietly, clearly wishing to deflect attention. "It was a minor contribution." "Nonsense! Worthington continued, oblivious to the social awkwardness he'd created. You argued convincingly that notation itself shapes mathematical thought. Quite revolutionary. Dashwood, did you know your sister's governess is one of the finest mathematical philosophers in England? Alexander met Eleanor's eyes across the table. In them he saw embarrassment, pride, vulnerability, and something else. A silent plea that he navigate this moment carefully. He had a choice: acknowledge her accomplishment and elevate her status, or maintain social hierarchy and leave her exposed. I was aware Miss Beaumont possesses exceptional scholarly credentials, Alexander said carefully. It's precisely why I engaged her, for Lady Catherine's education. My sister requires intellectual challenge, not merely social polish. How extraordinary, Lady Pemberton said, her tone making extraordinary sound suspicious. A governess with scholarly publications. One wonders why such a woman requires employment at all. The insult was subtle but clear. Eleanor's need to work marked her as inferior regardless of her accomplishments. Eleanor's face had gone pale, but her chin lifted slightly, and Alexander saw the pride that would not let her bow before contempt. One wonders, Eleanor replied with deadly politeness, why society considers inheritance a greater qualification than achievement. But then, comfortable circumstances rarely inspire reflection on their own arbitrariness. Gasps rippled around the table. Victoria looked shocked. Lady Pemberton turned crimson with outrage. Catherine bit back a smile. Lord Worthington laughed outright. Well said, Miss Beaumont, he declared. You always had courage to match your intelligence. Alexander should have smoothed the moment, redirected conversation, protected social harmony. Instead, he found himself speaking truth. Miss Beaumont is correct. We inherit privilege and then congratulate ourselves on possessing it, as though our virtues created our circumstances rather than our circumstances creating the appearance of virtue. Victoria stared at him as though he'd begun speaking in tongues. Alexander, surely you're not suggesting that birth and breeding don't matter? I'm suggesting they matter less than character and capability, he replied, his eyes still on Eleanor. And that intelligence deserves respect regardless of its social packaging. The dinner party never recovered its festive atmosphere. Conversations resumed, but remained strained. When the ladies withdrew after the meal, Victoria cornered Alexander in the portrait gallery with ice in her voice. What was that display? She demanded. You humiliated my mother by defending a servant who insulted her. Miss Beaumont is not a servant. She's a scholar who happens to work as a governess. And your mother insulted her first. A distinction without difference. Victoria's beautiful face had hardened into something almost ugly. I won't have my future home filled with insubordinate employees who consider themselves our equals. When we're married, she will be dismissed immediately. Something in Alexander snapped, some final thread of polite pretense that had been fraying since Eleanor Beaumont arrived at Ravenwood Abbey. No, he said quietly. I beg your pardon? I said no. You will not dictate the management of my household or the retention of my staff. Victoria drew herself up to full height, her eyes flashing. I will be your Duchess. I will have authority over household matters. You cannot deny me this. I can, and I do. Alexander's voice remained calm, but implacable. Miss Beaumont has transformed my sister's education and brought intellectual life to this house. She stays. For now, perhaps. Victoria's smile was cold. But once we're married, Alexander, you'll discover that a wife has considerable influence. I can make any employee's life quite uncomfortable without technically dismissing them. The threat was clear. Alexander looked at his betrothed, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since their engagement. He saw a beautiful shell containing pettiness, cruelty, and small-minded pride. He saw a lifetime of such conversations stretching ahead, of defending what he valued against someone who valued only status and control. Victoria, he said slowly, I think we need to discuss our engagement. Her eyes widened. What do you mean? I mean that I'm beginning to question whether we're suited to one another. We're perfectly suited. Victoria's voice rose. Two great families, equal wealth, appropriate breeding, but no affection, no intellectual compatibility, no genuine regard beyond what protocol requires. Love is for peasants, Victoria said with disdain. We have duty, position, responsibility. That's what matters in our world. Perhaps. Alexander moved to the window, looking out over the darkened grounds. But what if our world is wrong? What if duty without affection is merely a prison dressed in silk? You're being absurd. Victoria's voice had gone brittle with panic. This is that governess's influence. She's put radical ideas in your head. She's made me think, Alexander corrected, perhaps for the first time in years. Then stop thinking, Victoria nearly shouted. Be what you're supposed to be, the Duke of Ravenwood, my husband, a pillar of society. Stop questioning and accept your role. The irony was not lost on Alexander, Victoria demanding he stop thinking, while Eleanor encouraged Catherine to think freely. The contrast crystallized everything he'd been trying to ignore for weeks. I need time, he said finally, time to consider whether this marriage serves either of us beyond the material advantages. There is no time, Victoria said coldly. Our engagement ball is in 10 days. Invitations have been sent. Settlements are signed. You cannot break our engagement without creating a scandal that would destroy both our families' reputations. She was right, and they both knew it. Breaking an engagement this late was social suicide. Victoria would be pitied and gossiped about, labelled as unfit or rejected. Alexander would be considered dishonourable, his word worthless. The scandal would taint Catherine's prospects and Ravenwood's name. Then we proceed as planned, Alexander said heavily, feeling the trap close around him. Victoria's smile returned, triumphant and merciless. Yes, we proceed. And after we're married, Alexander, you'll learn that I always get what I want, including the removal of presumptuous governesses who forget their place. After Victoria departed to her rooms, Alexander remained in the portrait gallery, staring at his ancestors' painted faces. Generations of Dashwoods stared back, all of them having done their duty, married appropriately, maintained the estate and family honour. None of them, he suspected, had been happy. Duty had been enough for them. Why couldn't it be enough for him? He found himself walking to the library, knowing Eleanor might be there, knowing he should stay away, unable to resist. She was seated at the table, her monograph spread before her, but she wasn't working. Her face was buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent tears. Eleanor! He was beside her without conscious decision, his hand on her shoulder. Please don't! She looked up, her face wet with tears, and the raw pain in her eyes struck him like a physical blow. I'll leave tomorrow, she said, her voice breaking. I can't stay here, not after tonight. I've caused enough disruption. Catherine has progressed wonderfully. She can continue independently now. No. Alexander found himself kneeling beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Don't leave. Catherine needs you. The household needs you. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, unable to voice what they both knew. You're getting married in 10 days, Eleanor said softly, tears still streaming down her face. To a woman who wants me gone. Alexander, there's no future in this, whatever we feel. And I won't insult either of us by pretending I don't feel it. It leads nowhere but heartbreak and ruin. I know, he said, his voice raw. I know all the reasons why this is impossible. I know my duty, my obligations, the consequences of scandal. I know that breaking my engagement would destroy reputations and prove me dishonourable. I know all of this, Eleanor, and yet, she searched his face with desperate hope. And yet I find myself thinking that a lifetime of duty without love is a form of death. That honour which requires me to marry someone I don't love while dismissing someone He stopped, the words too dangerous to speak aloud. Someone you what? Eleanor whispered. Alexander looked into her eyes, those remarkable grey-green eyes that had haunted him since her arrival, and let the truth finally surface. Someone I love beyond reason. Someone I love despite every argument against it, despite the impossibility, despite knowing that choosing you means choosing scandal and social ruin. Eleanor's breath caught. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but her hands tightened on his. You can't choose me. The cost is too high. The cost of not choosing you is higher, Alexander said, and in that moment the decision crystallized. Victoria was right about one thing. I will create a scandal, but she was wrong about the outcome. Let society gossip. Let them call me dishonorable. I would rather be judged for choosing happiness than praised for embracing misery. Your sister, Catherine, will understand. She's argued since our parents' death that I prioritize duty over life. Perhaps it's time I listened. The estate will survive. It survived 3 centuries. It will survive my choosing love over dynastic alliance. Eleanor pulled her hands free, standing abruptly, putting distance between them. Stop. Please stop. You're proposing to break your engagement, create a scandal that will be discussed for years, and marry your sister's governess. Think about what you're saying, Alexander. Think about tomorrow, next month, next year, when the passionate impulse fades and you're left dealing with the consequences. I've thought of nothing else for weeks, Alexander said, rising to face her. Every logical argument counsels accepting my engagement to Victoria, yet logic has brought me nothing but the prospect of comfortable unhappiness. You make me question everything, Eleanor. Not just my engagement, but my understanding of duty, honor, social order. You've shown me that there's more to life than maintaining appearances and following predetermined paths. I've disrupted your life, Eleanor said bitterly. I should never have come here. You've saved my life, Alexander countered. I was sleepwalking toward a future that would have slowly killed every vital part of me. You woke me up. They stood in the lamplight of the library, surrounded by thousands of volumes that spoke of other people's lives, other people's wisdom. The moment stretched between them, laden with possibility and danger in equal measure. I love you, Alexander said simply. Whatever comes of that admission, whatever the cost, I love you. And I cannot, will not, marry Victoria while knowing I love you. Eleanor closed her eyes, tears streaming freely now. When she opened them again, her face held resolution mixed with wonder. I love you too, she whispered. God help us both. I love you. But Alexander, the scandal will be tremendous. Victoria and her family will not accept this quietly. Society will ostracize us. Catherine's prospects may be damaged. Are you truly prepared for those consequences? Are you? Alexander asked, moving closer. Because they'll fall most heavily on you. You'll be labeled the governess who seduced her employer, a scheming fortune hunter who broke an engagement. The aristocracy will close ranks against you. You'll be socially ruined. I'm already socially nothing, Eleanor said with painful honesty. I have no rank to lose, no reputation beyond my professional credentials. But you're the Duke of Ravenwood. You have everything to lose. And everything to gain, Alexander said, closing the final distance between them. Let me show you something. He led her to the portrait of his parents, hung prominently near the library entrance. In the painting, they stood together but apart, their expressions formal, their bodies angled away from each other. No warmth, no connection, only duty captured in oil and canvas. They married for all the right reasons, Alexander said quietly. Family alliance, appropriate rank, social expectations, and they were profoundly unhappy. I grew up watching them live in the same house yet inhabit separate worlds. When they died in that carriage accident, I wondered if some part of them welcomed the escape. He turned to Eleanor. I will not repeat their mistake. I will not choose duty over love and spend the rest of my life regretting it. Eleanor looked at the portrait, then back at Alexander, her expression softening. What do you propose we do? Tomorrow morning, I ride to the Pemberton's estate and break my engagement to Victoria. I'll take full responsibility. Insist the fault is mine alone. Yes, there will be scandal. Yes, society will condemn me. But once the immediate uproar settles, I'll court you properly, as publicly as you'll allow, making clear my intentions are honourable. And then, Eleanor's voice was barely audible. And then, Eleanor Beaumont, when sufficient time has passed for propriety's sake, I'll ask you to marry me. I'm offering you a dukedom gained through scandal, social isolation from most of the aristocracy, and a man who has finally learned that love matters more than reputation. It's not much of an offer. It's everything, Eleanor said, and then she was in his arms, her face pressed against his chest, her tears soaking his waistcoat. It's everything I never dared hope for. But Alexander, promise me you won't act rashly. Speak with Catherine first. Make certain of your decision. I couldn't bear it if you regretted. He tilted her face up, and for the first time he kissed her. It was gentle at first, then deeper, filled with weeks of restrained passion, finally released. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Eleanor's face flushed, Alexander's carefully controlled composure entirely shattered. No regrets, he said firmly. Not anymore. Only honesty and hope. In the morning, Ravenwood Abbey would erupt in scandal. But in that moment, in the library's lamplit peace, two people who'd been taught that duty mattered more than love chose to believe otherwise. The revolution, it seemed, began not with armies or politics, but with a duke and a governess deciding that their hearts mattered more than society's expectations. Dawn came to Ravenwood Abbey cold and brilliant, frost transforming the grounds into a crystalline fairyland. Alexander had not slept. He'd remained in his study all night, composing and discarding drafts of the letter he would send to Lord Pemberton, formally withdrawing from his engagement to Victoria. Each version seemed inadequate. How does one politely shatter social expectations and violate agreements that represent months of negotiation? Finally, he'd written simply and honestly, Lord Pemberton, it is with profound regret and full acknowledgement of my breach of honour that I must withdraw from my engagement to Lady Victoria. The fault is entirely mine. A failure to understand my own heart until circumstances made continued deception impossible. Lady Victoria deserves a husband who can offer her genuine devotion, which I cannot provide. I take full responsibility for any scandal this may create and will make financial restitution for any costs incurred in preparation for our wedding. Most sincerely and with deepest apologies, Alexander Dashwood, Duke of Ravenwood. The letter sat on his desk, sealed but not yet sent. Once posted, there would be no retreat. Alexander stared at it as the sun rose, wondering if he was brave or simply foolish. Then he remembered Eleanor's face in the lamplight, the truth in her eyes, and knew that whatever the cost, this was right. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Catherine entered without waiting for permission, still in her dressing gown, her face alight with barely contained excitement. "Is it true?" she demanded. "Mrs. Ashworth says you've broken your engagement." The Pembertons departed at dawn, in an absolute fury. Alexander blinked. "What? I haven't yet sent—" "Victoria saw you," Catherine said, moving to the window where morning light illuminated her face. "Last night in the library, kissing Eleanor. She told me before she left, said you'd betrayed her with a servant, that you were dishonourable and beneath contempt. Her mother was apoplectic. They've gone back to their estate, and Lady Pemberton was making threats about ruining our family's reputation." Alexander's heart sank. He had hoped to control the narrative, to take responsibility clearly and protect Eleanor from the worst accusations. Instead, Victoria had witnessed the kiss and would now portray Eleanor as a scheming seductress. The scandal would be far worse than he'd anticipated. "Alexander?" Catherine's voice had softened with concern. "Are you all right?" "I've created a disaster," he said heavily. "I meant to break the engagement honourably, taking full blame. Now Victoria will paint Eleanor as the villain, and society will believe it because that story confirms their prejudices." "So we tell the truth," Catherine said fiercely. "You fell in love. Victoria was wrong for you. Anyone with eyes could see that. Eleanor is brilliant and kind, and she makes you happy for the first time since mother and father died. Why should you sacrifice happiness for society's arbitrary rules? Because those arbitrary rules have power, Alexander replied. Eleanor will be destroyed by this, Catherine. Governesses live by their reputations. Once branded as a woman who seduced her employer and broke his engagement, no respectable family will employ her. I've saved myself from a loveless marriage, but potentially ruined Eleanor's life. Then marry her quickly, Catherine suggested practically. Once she's the Duchess of Ravenwood, society will have to accept her. It's not that simple. Alexander moved to stand beside his sister, both of them looking out over the frost-covered grounds. There's a mourning period expected after breaking an engagement, 6 months at minimum before courting another woman. If I marry Eleanor immediately, it confirms Victoria's accusations of prior infidelity. Eleanor's honor will be permanently stained. But if you wait 6 months, she has no income, no position, nowhere to go, Catherine countered. You've put her in an impossible situation, Alexander. The truth of it struck him like a physical blow. In following his heart, he'd failed to think through the practical implications for Eleanor. She depended on her income as a governess. Without references, which no employer would provide once this scandal spread, she couldn't secure another position. She had no family wealth to sustain her during a 6-month wait. He'd trapped her in limbo between positions, between identities, with no clear path forward. I need to speak with her, Alexander said, moving toward the door. She's gone, Catherine said quietly. Alexander froze. What? She left at dawn before the Pembertons departed. Left a note for me. Catherine pulled a folded paper from her dressing gown pocket, handing it to her brother with clear reluctance. Alexander unfolded the letter with shaking hands. Dearest Catherine, by the time you read this, I will have departed Ravenwood Abbey. Last night, in the emotional intensity of the moment, your brother and I spoke words and took actions that seemed possible in lamplight, but become impossible in dawn's clarity. He is a duke, with responsibilities far beyond personal happiness. I am a governess, whose livelihood depends on reputation now irretrievably damaged. I love him. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise, but love, I have learned, is sometimes not enough when reality intrudes. Your brother believes he can weather scandal for my sake, but I cannot let him destroy his family's name, your prospects, and his position in society. The cost is too high, and I am not worth it. You, my brilliant girl, have been the greatest joy of my professional life. Continue your studies. Never let society dim your intellect or convince you that feminine learning is shameful. You have a remarkable mind. Use it boldly. Tell your brother I'm sorry. Tell him duty is sometimes the truest form of love. Tell him to repair his engagement if possible, or find another suitable match. Tell him I will treasure our brief time together, but understand it belonged to dream, not reality. With deepest affection and lasting admiration, Eleanor. The letter crumpled in Alexander's fist. She had left. She had chosen for him, deciding that his duty mattered more than their love, that protecting him from scandal justified her own sacrifice. The nobility of it struck him like mockery. She was noble, while he had been reckless and selfish, failing to calculate consequences before declaring love. Where did she go? He demanded. The letter doesn't say. Mrs. Ashworth said she took the early mail coach toward London. Alexander, what are you going to do? What was he going to do? The sensible answer: let her go. Accept that the scandal had made their attachment impossible. Find another suitable bride after appropriate time had passed. Resume his life as the Duke of Ravenwood, dutiful and slowly dying inside. The honest answer: refuse to accept it. Find her. Fight for her. Prove that love could overcome scandal if one had the courage to weather the storm. I'm going after her, Alexander said, decision crystallizing into certainty. The scandal is already unleashed. Victoria saw us together. She's telling her version of events even now. Eleanor leaving doesn't reduce the damage. It only means she faces consequences alone, while I remain safely at Ravenwood. I won't allow that. But how will you find her in London? Catherine asked practically. It's an enormous city. Lord Worthington, Alexander said, remembering the elderly scholar from dinner. He knows Eleanor's professional network. If anyone can help locate her, he can. Within the hour, Alexander had dispatched an urgent message to Lord Worthington's estate requesting immediate assistance in locating Miss Eleanor Beaumont. He also wrote to several London scholars whose names he'd heard Eleanor mention, asking if she'd contacted them seeking employment or refuge. Then came the hardest part, waiting. The scandal spread like wildfire through local society. By afternoon, 3 families had sent notes cancelling social engagements, their tone making clear that the Duke of Ravenwood was now considered dishonourable. Lady Pemberton had apparently shared a detailed and damning account of the situation, casting Eleanor as a calculating seductress and Alexander as a fool. The Evening Post brought vindication of a sort. Lord Worthington's reply. Dashwood, Miss Beaumont contacted me this morning seeking a letter of reference. I provided one gladly, praising her scholarly work and teaching excellence. She would not tell me what precipitated her sudden departure from Ravenwood, but your inquiry suggests complications of the heart. If you have affection for Miss Beaumont, prove it through action, not declarations. She has taken lodgings at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house in Bloomsbury, address enclosed. She plans to seek a position at a girls' academy, or failing that, as a copyist for scholarly publications. Do not waste this opportunity through cowardice or excessive regard for social opinion. Life is short, and genuine love is rare. Worthington. Alexander read the letter 3 times, emotions warring within him. Relief that Eleanor was safe, gratitude for Worthington's assistance, and determination crystallizing into iron resolve. He found Catherine in the library, studying alone now that her teacher had departed. I'm going to London, he announced. I'm going to find Eleanor and ask her properly in daylight and sobriety if she'll marry me. If she agrees, I'll marry her immediately, scandal be damned. Catherine looked up, her face breaking into a brilliant smile. Finally, you're being decisive instead of agonizing. There will be consequences, Alexander warned. Social ostracism, at least temporarily. Your prospects may be affected. My prospects can weather scandal better than they can weather having a brother who sacrifices his happiness on my account, Catherine said firmly. Besides, once the initial uproar settles, society will find new scandals to obsess over. 6 months from now, the Duke who married his sister's governess will be old news. You have more faith in society's short memory than I do, Alexander said dryly. But you're right about one thing. I've spent too long agonizing over consequences instead of acting. Eleanor deserves better than a man who offers love with one hand while reaching for duty with the other. He departed for London the next morning, riding through a countryside bright with early spring. Snowdrops bloomed along the roadside, and the air carried that particular clarity that comes after winter's breaking. Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine hope untempered by duty's constraints. London overwhelmed as it always did, the noise, the crowds, the chaos of the greatest city in the world. Alexander navigated to Bloomsbury, a respectable but unfashionable district favoured by scholars, writers and professional women. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house occupied a narrow building on a quiet street, its facade speaking of genteel poverty and maintained dignity. He knocked, and a severe-looking woman answered. Mrs. Henderson herself, he presumed. I'm looking for Miss Eleanor Beaumont, he said. It's urgent that I speak with her. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed, taking in his expensive clothes and aristocratic bearing. Miss Beaumont is not receiving visitors. She's been quite clear about that. Please, Alexander said, abandoning pride, tell her the Duke of Ravenwood is here. Tell her I've come to apologize and to ask for her hand in marriage if she'll still have me. Tell her I'm prepared to wait on this doorstep until she agrees to see me, even if it takes days. Mrs. Henderson's stern expression softened slightly. A duke on my doorstep proposing to a governess. I've seen much in my 40 years running this establishment, but never that. Wait here. She disappeared inside. Alexander stood on the step, heart pounding, aware that Eleanor might refuse to see him. Minutes stretched like hours. Then Mrs. Henderson returned, her expression unreadable. "Miss Beaumont will see you in the parlour. 10 minutes, Your Grace, and the door remains open." Alexander followed her inside to a small but spotless parlour, furnished with threadbare but clean furniture. Eleanor stood by the window, silhouetted against afternoon light. She changed from her governess's modest dress into something even plainer, the clothing of someone who had accepted her descent in social status. When she turned to face him, her eyes were red from crying, but her chin was raised in determined pride. "You shouldn't have come," she said without preamble. "It makes everything worse." "Everything is already as bad as it can be," Alexander replied. "Victoria witnessed our kiss. She's told everyone that you seduced me away from her. The scandal is complete, Eleanor. You leaving doesn't reduce it. It only means you face the consequences alone. Better one of us suffer than both," she said quietly. "You can rebuild your reputation, find another suitable bride. I can find work under an assumed name, perhaps, or you can marry me," Alexander interrupted. "Immediately. Today, if possible. I have a special license. I came prepared." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." Marrying now in the midst of scandal would only confirm Victoria's accusations. Society would say, "I'd always planned to entrap you." "Society will say what it wishes regardless of our actions," Alexander countered, moving closer. "But if you're my Duchess, Eleanor, you have position and protection. As my wife, you're untouchable. The aristocracy may disapprove, but they must acknowledge you. As a governess accused of seduction, you're vulnerable to every malicious tongue." "I don't want to be a duchess," Eleanor said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I want to be a scholar, a teacher, an independent woman." "Why can't you be all of those things, and also a duchess?" Alexander asked. "Catherine needs you. She's barely begun her education. Ravenwood Abbey has resources that could support your research. As Duchess, you'd have the position to advocate for women's education, to use your influence for causes you believe in. Eleanor, I'm not asking you to surrender your identity. I'm offering you a platform to expand it." "You're offering scandal and social ostracism," Eleanor corrected, but she was wavering. He could see it in her eyes. "Your friends will abandon you. Your peers will mock you. Is my love worth that price?" "Yes," Alexander said simply, "though I hope in time to prove it's not love alone, but the rightness of choosing a partner who challenges and completes me rather than one who merely looks appropriate on my arm. I've been wrong about many things, Eleanor. I was wrong to believe duty could substitute for passion, wrong to think society's expectations mattered more than personal truth, wrong to value bloodlines over character. I'm trying to be right about this, about you, about us." Tears slipped down Eleanor's cheeks. "I'm terrified," she whispered, "terrified of ruining your life, terrified of failing as a duchess, terrified that 6 months from now you'll regret this decision and resent me for it." "I'm terrified too," Alexander admitted, closing the final distance between them and taking her hands. "Terrified of losing you. Terrified of returning to Ravenwood Abbey alone and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd had the courage to fight for you. Eleanor Beaumont, will you marry me? Not because I'm a duke or you're a governess, but because we're two people who have found something rare and precious that deserves fighting for." "Yes," she said, the word emerging between laughter and tears. "God help us both, yes. I'll marry you, Alexander Dashwood, and we'll weather this scandal together." He kissed her then, there in Mrs. Henderson's shabby parlour, while the landlady watched from the doorway with tears in her own eyes. It was not a kiss of desperate passion, but of solemn promise. Two people choosing each other despite the world's objections, despite the consequences they would face together. They were married the next day at a small church in Bloomsbury, with Lord Worthington standing as witness and Mrs. Henderson in attendance, dabbing her eyes throughout the ceremony. No grand society wedding, no crowds of aristocratic guests, no celebration befitting a duke's marriage. Just two people making vows before God and a handful of sympathetic witnesses. Afterward, they returned to Ravenwood Abbey as husband and wife, prepared to face whatever consequences awaited them. The staff, informed by express message, had prepared for their arrival. Catherine greeted them in the entrance hall, her face alight with joy. "Finally," she declared, embracing Eleanor warmly. "Welcome home, Your Grace, and welcome to the family." Eleanor, now the Duchess of Ravenwood, looked around the grand entrance hall with wonder and trepidation. "I have no idea how to be a duchess," she admitted. "Then we'll figure it out together," Alexander said, taking her hand. "After all, I'm still learning how to be a man who chooses love over duty. We're both in new territory." Outside, the spring afternoon was giving way to evening. Somewhere in London, Victoria and her mother were undoubtedly crafting their narrative of the scandal. Somewhere across England, the Ton was gossiping about the Duke who had married his sister's governess. Somewhere in the social machinery of aristocratic England, consequences were being prepared. But in Ravenwood Abbey's entrance hall, three people stood together in defiance of social convention. A duke who had chosen his heart, a governess who had dared to accept him, and a young woman who had witnessed that love matters more than rank. The scandal was only beginning. But so was their real life together. 6 months after the wedding that scandalized Regency England, Ravenwood Abbey had settled into a rhythm unlike anything in its 3-century history. The Duke of Ravenwood, once a bastion of propriety and social conformity, now presided over an estate that had become something of an intellectual salon, drawing scholars, reformers and freethinkers rather than the traditional aristocratic set. Eleanor Dashwood, the Duchess of Ravenwood, sat in the library on an April morning, sunlight streaming through the high windows, illuminating the pages of her manuscript. Her mathematical monograph, originally begun as a private scholarly project, was now being prepared for publication by Cambridge University Press, a feat nearly unprecedented for a female author. The academic world had been forced to acknowledge what Lord Worthington had long argued. Eleanor's intellect was exceptional regardless of her gender or her unorthodox path to a dukedom. The initial scandal had been precisely as bad as anticipated. For the first 3 months after their marriage, society had closed ranks against them with impressive unanimity. Invitations ceased. Former friends crossed the street to avoid greeting them. The Pembertons had mounted a vicious campaign of character assassination, with Victoria painting herself as the innocent victim of Eleanor's calculated seduction. But then, gradually, cracks had appeared in society's united front. Lord Worthington had hosted a dinner party prominently featuring the new Duke and Duchess of Ravenwood, lending his considerable social weight to their rehabilitation. Several intellectual aristocrats, more interested in Eleanor's scholarship than her origins, had followed suit, and Catherine, blooming under her sister-in-law's continued guidance, had become something of a sensation at her first season, her intelligence proving attractive rather than off-putting to a certain class of forward-thinking young men. "You're smiling," Alexander observed, entering the library with the morning's correspondence. At 29, he looked younger than he had before his marriage. The constant tension that had marked his features during his engagement to Victoria had been replaced by contentment that animated his face. "Good news? Just reflecting on how far we've come," Eleanor said, setting aside her manuscript. At 27, she had grown into her role as Duchess with surprising grace, discovering that being a reforming aristocrat suited her better than being a discreet governess. 6 months ago, we were social pariahs. Now I'm publishing with Cambridge. You've been invited to speak at the Royal Society, and Catherine has 3 eligible suitors. 3 very carefully vetted suitors, Alexander corrected, settling beside his wife. I've learned from experience that intelligence and compatibility matter more than lineage. Though I notice Catherine seems most interested in Mr. Harrison, the architect's son. The youngest son of a successful but non-aristocratic architect, Eleanor said, amusement in her voice. Society must be horrified that the Duke of Ravenwood's sister might marry beneath her station. Society, Alexander said dryly, has already exhausted its capacity for horror on our account. Catherine's choice of husband seems minor in comparison to a duke marrying his sister's governess. Eleanor laughed, the sound warm and free. Marriage had given her not just security and position, but permission to be fully herself, scholar, teacher, reformer, and wife in equal measure. The role of duchess, which she'd feared would confine her, had instead amplified her voice. When the Duchess of Ravenwood advocated for women's education, people listened in ways they never had when Eleanor Beaumont, Governess, had argued the same positions. "Letter from Victoria," Alexander said, holding up a cream-coloured envelope bearing the Pemberton crest. "This should be interesting." Eleanor felt a familiar tension at the name. Victoria had been their most persistent critic, ensuring the scandal remained fresh in society's memory, opening correspondence from her promised nothing pleasant. Alexander broke the seal and read, his eyebrows rising. "Extraordinary. She's announcing her engagement to Lord Hartley." "At the Earl of Dartmoor's heir?" Eleanor asked, surprised. Hartley was known as a pleasant but unremarkable young man, wealthy but lacking any particular distinction. Rather a descent from a duke. Victoria would see it that way, Alexander agreed. But the interesting part is her letter's tone. It's almost conciliatory. She writes that she wishes us well and hopes we might achieve civil relations in the future, given we'll likely encounter each other in society. "That's shockingly mature of her," Eleanor said, though suspicion coloured her voice. "What prompted this sudden magnanimity?" According to the letter, perspective. She writes, "I have come to understand that our engagement was as wrong for you as it ultimately was for me. Lord Hartley offers me the comfortable, unchallenging partnership I desire, while you clearly required something I could never provide. Perhaps we each found our proper match." Alexander lowered the letter. "She's not entirely wrong." "She's entirely right," Eleanor corrected gently. "You and Victoria would have made each other miserable. The scandal freed you both to find more suitable partners." She paused. Though I wish the freeing had been less painful for her, she was genuinely hurt and humiliated. Your capacity for empathy towards someone who tried to destroy your reputation is remarkable, Alexander said, taking Eleanor's hand. "Most people would still resent her." "I can afford empathy now that I'm safely a duchess," Eleanor replied pragmatically. "If I were still a governess dependent on references, I'd likely feel less charitable. Security makes generosity easier." The door burst open with familiar energy. Catherine, now 16 and having completed her first season, swept in with characteristic disregard for formal entrances. She had grown into her fierce intelligence, learning from Eleanor how to be both intellectually formidable and socially adept. "Eleanor, Alexander, Mr. Harrison has asked permission to court me officially. I told him he must speak with Alexander first, following tedious propriety, but I wanted you to know my answer will be yes." Her face glowed with happiness. Alexander rose, his expression shifting into protective older brother mode. "Mr. Harrison, the architect's son, the man with modern ideas about buildings and absolutely no understanding of agricultural management. The man with brilliant ideas about incorporating natural light and air circulation into building design, which could revolutionize estate management," Catherine countered. "And who cares deeply about using his skills for social good, rather than merely enriching the already wealthy? He wants to design model housing for workers, Alexander. Practical, beautiful homes for ordinary people." "He's not aristocratic," Alexander said, but his tone lacked real objection. "Neither was I," Eleanor interjected quietly, "yet you married me." Alexander turned to his wife, his stern expression dissolving into a smile. "Point taken. Though in my defense, you were at least a duchess when I married you. We'd elevated you to aristocracy before the wedding." "We did no such thing," Eleanor laughed. "You married a governess and made society accept it. Catherine will marry an architect's son, and will make society accept that too. You're both determined to systematically dismantle every social convention," Alexander said, but his tone held affection rather than criticism. "Very well. When Mr. Harrison calls, I'll hear him out, but I'll be thorough in my questions, Catherine. If he's to marry you, he'd better be worthy." "He is," Catherine said with utter confidence. "He sees me, really sees me, the way Eleanor taught me a true partner should. He admires my intellect rather than being threatened by it. And he makes me laugh, which Eleanor says is crucial for a long marriage." After Catherine departed to prepare for Mr. Harrison's visit, Eleanor and Alexander remained in the library, comfortable in each other's presence. Through the windows, they could see the grounds of Ravenwood Abbey bursting with spring life, daffodils blooming in profusion, trees clothed in new green, the world renewing itself. "Regrets?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "About the scandal, the social consequences, the way our marriage began." Alexander considered the question seriously, as he considered all of Eleanor's questions. It was one of the things she loved most about him. He never dismissed her thoughts or offered easy platitudes. "No regrets about marrying you," he said finally, "but I do regret causing you pain through my initial recklessness. I should have broken my engagement to Victoria before declaring myself to you. I should have managed the situation with more foresight." "You were human," Eleanor said gently. "Imperfect, impulsive, driven by feeling rather than calculation. If you'd been perfectly controlled, perfectly strategic, you probably would have talked yourself out of pursuing me at all." "True," Alexander admitted. "Logic counseled against it rather forcefully. My heart simply refused to listen." "I'm grateful for your heart's stubbornness," Eleanor said, "because logic would have left us both in appropriate but joyless matches. You would have married Victoria, I would have remained a governess moving from family to family, and we both would have spent our lives wondering what we'd missed by choosing safety over passion." "Do you miss it?" Alexander asked. "Governessing, I mean? The teaching, the intellectual focus without the Duchess responsibilities?" Eleanor smiled. "I miss aspects of it. The intimacy of working one-on-one with a student, watching understanding dawn in their eyes. But I don't miss the precarity, the awareness that one false step could cost me my livelihood. And as Duchess, I can teach on a broader scale. We've established scholarships for girls from ordinary families, funded that experimental school for women's education, supported publications on female learning. I touch more lives now than I ever could have as a governess." "You've transformed this estate," Alexander said, pride evident in his voice. "Not just the social impact, but the culture here. The servants speak of you with genuine affection. They say you remember their names, ask about their families, treat them as people rather than furniture. The tenants tell me you've revolutionized the village school. You've made Ravenwood Abbey a better place." "We've made it better together," Eleanor corrected. "You allowed the transformation. A duchess can only accomplish what her duke permits." "Then I'm grateful," Alexander said, "that I had the sense to marry a revolutionary rather than a decorative ornament." As afternoon shifted toward evening, they prepared for the social event that would mark a turning point in their rehabilitation. A dinner party featuring several prominent intellectual families, including Lord and Lady Worthington, 3 Cambridge professors and their wives, the Hartleys, Victoria and her new fiancé, and Mr. Harrison seeking to formally court Catherine. It would be the first time Eleanor and Victoria had met since the scandal. Eleanor dressed with particular care, choosing a gown that balanced aristocratic elegance with scholarly seriousness, deep blue silk with minimal ornamentation, her only jewellery the Ravenwood pearls that marked her as the estate's duchess. When Victoria arrived with Lord Hartley, Eleanor saw immediately what Alexander had meant about the match being suitable. Hartley was pleasant but unexceptional, requiring nothing from Victoria beyond agreeable companionship. They looked comfortable together in a way Victoria and Alexander never had. "Your Grace," Victoria greeted Eleanor with a curtsy that exactly balanced respect for rank with personal coolness. "Thank you for the invitation." "You're welcome, Lady Victoria," Eleanor replied with equal formality. "May I congratulate you on your engagement? I hope you and Lord Hartley will be very happy." Victoria's perfect features showed a flash of genuine emotion. surprise perhaps at Eleanor's graciousness. "Thank you. I hope the same for you and Alexander, despite our difficult history." It was not warmth exactly, but it was détente. The two women regarded each other with new understanding, not friendship, but mutual recognition of each having found their proper place. The dinner party proceeded with animated conversation about mathematics, architecture, natural philosophy, and social reform. Catherine and Mr. Harrison engaged in spirited debate about building design, their intellectual compatibility evident. Lord Worthington held forth on classical languages, while his wife discussed her charity work with Eleanor. The Hartleys contributed pleasant but unremarkable observations, and Alexander, Eleanor noticed, seemed genuinely content, engaged with the conversation, laughing easily, entirely present in a way he never had been during his engagement to Victoria. After dinner, as guests gathered in the drawing room, Lord Worthington proposed a toast. "To the Duke and Duchess of Ravenwood," he said, raising his glass, "who proved that love and intellect need not bow before social convention. May their marriage continue to challenge and inspire us all." "To love and intellect," the gathering echoed, glasses rising. Later, after all the guests had departed and the household had settled into night's quiet, Eleanor and Alexander stood together in the portrait gallery. His parents' painting still hung there, a reminder of duty without love. But beside it now hung a new portrait, Eleanor and Alexander together, her hand on his shoulder, both their faces animated with genuine warmth. The artist had captured something remarkable: equality, partnership, intellectual connection alongside romantic love. "Look at that," Eleanor said softly, studying the dual portraits. "Your parents frozen in duty and distance, us alive with possibility." "We've rewritten the family story," Alexander agreed. "No more generations of Dashwoods trapped in loveless but appropriate marriages. Catherine will marry for love and compatibility. Our children—" He paused, glancing at Eleanor with sudden hope. "If we're fortunate enough to have children, they'll grow up seeing marriage as partnership, not transaction." When we have children," Eleanor corrected gently, her hand moving to her still flat stomach, "they'll grow up seeing both duty and love, both tradition and progress. We're not rejecting the past entirely, Alexander. We're building on it, improving it, making it more human." Alexander's eyes widened. "Eleanor, are you saying—" "I'm saying that in approximately 6 months you'll be a father." Her smile was radiant. "We'll be parents." He kissed her then, there in the portrait gallery beneath the eyes of all his ancestors, and Eleanor felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. They had chosen each other against society's expectations, had weathered scandal and social ostracism, had proved that love could survive and thrive despite imperfect beginnings. Through the gallery windows, dawn was breaking over Derbyshire, a new day illuminating Ravenwood Abbey's ancient stones with fresh promise. Somewhere in England, society was still gossiping about the Duke who married his sister's governess. But at Ravenwood Abbey itself, scandal had transformed into something far more valuable, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, intellectual compatibility, and profound love. Eleanor Beaumont had arrived at this estate as hired help, invisible except when needed. She had left as Eleanor Dashwood, Duchess of Ravenwood, visible, respected, and deeply loved. The transformation was not from poverty to wealth or low status to high rank, though those shifts had occurred. The true transformation was from a world where duty strangled joy to one where duty and joy could coexist, where social responsibility and personal happiness need not be enemies. Alexander had been raised to believe control and propriety defined an aristocrat's worth. Eleanor had taught him that courage and authenticity mattered more. Together, they were redefining what it meant to be Duke and Duchess, not as titles that demanded the sacrifice of self, but as roles that could amplify one's best qualities and create positive change. As morning light filled the gallery, Alexander rested his hand over Eleanor's, over the place where their child grew. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what? For challenging me, for refusing to let me choose comfortable misery over difficult joy, for being brave enough to accept my proposal despite the scandal it would cause, for making me a better man than I was prepared to be." "We made each other better," Eleanor replied. "That's what love does when it's genuine, not the polite affection society recommends, but the fierce, inconvenient, world-altering kind that demands we become our best selves." They stood together as the household began to wake around them. Servants beginning their daily work, Catherine calling for her maid, the estate stirring into life. Ravenwood Abbey, ancient and steeped in tradition, was adapting to house a new kind of aristocratic family, one that valued merit over bloodline, partnership over hierarchy, love over duty. The scandal that had begun with a duke hiring a bright teacher for his fierce sister and falling for the woman he vowed to ignore had ended not in ruin, but in revolution. A quiet revolution, perhaps, contained within one estate and one unconventional marriage. But revolutions must start somewhere, and seeds planted in Ravenwood Abbey's fertile ground would spread. Catherine's marriage to a brilliant commoner, the scholarships funding women's education, Eleanor's published scholarship proving female intellectual capacity, and most importantly, a new generation of Dashwoods raised to believe that authentic love could coexist with aristocratic duty. In the end, Eleanor reflected, the greatest victory was not social acceptance, though that would come gradually as scandal aged into interesting history. The greatest victory was the life they had built together, imperfect, unconventional, but profoundly alive. They had chosen each other over society's expectations, and in that choice had proven that some kinds of breaking are actually building in disguise. The Duke and his Duchess, the aristocrat and the Governess, the man who had learned to value love and the woman who had taught him. Together they had rewritten the rules. And Ravenwood Abbey, bathed in morning light, stood witness to the truth that courage and love, when combined, can overcome even the most rigid social conventions. Their story would be told for generations, a scandalous beginning transformed into a legendary love. But for Eleanor and Alexander, standing together in the portrait gallery as dawn illuminated their shared future, the legend was less important than the daily reality of partnership, respect, and genuine joy. They had bloomed where they chose to plant themselves, not in the garden society designed for them, but in soil they cultivated together, watered with courage and tended with love. And that garden, unconventional though it was, proved more beautiful than any carefully manicured aristocratic landscape could ever be. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Until next time, may you have the courage to choose love over convenience, authenticity over appearance, and may you bloom wherever you choose to plant yourself.